welcome to another adventure in Australian literature. So before we start, now remember, we don't have Patreon, we don't have advertising, we don't have sponsorship, we have a shop. And in our shop, we have some real goodies. We have writing templates, which will help you with your writing. We have t-shirts. We have writing services, either a mentoring session or having your manuscript read, a reader's report, so that it's read and see what's going on with it. And we have books. We have science fiction comedy, have a book to help you write your novel, a book about family and community in rural Australia, book of funny verse, and another book about family and community, but this one a historical novel set during the First World War in the home front. So those are books, and let's get started with our book, Our Adventure in Australian Literature. So our book for this week, we're actually having a look at 4 books, and these are the 4 books. They are what are called the Langton Quartet. Now, these were written, there are 4 books. The first one is called Cardboard Crown. The second is called Difficult Young Man. The third is called An Outbreak of Love. And the fourth is called When Blackbirds Sing. So these books all form a quartet following the Langton family, a wealthy Anglo-Australian family from Melbourne. Now, you're hearing the name Martin Boyd if you're Australian, possibly if you're not Australian, possibly if you're further overseas, and you're asking, is that possibly any relation to Arthur Boyd? You know, the painter? Yes, these stories are the Boyds. Those Boyds, the Melbourne Boyds, Boyd family, of which Arthur is Martin's nephew. Martin's brother Merrick, who was Arthur, David, and there's another one's father. He founded really the Australian art pottery in his time. He's very important in terms of art world there. 2 of his sons were painters. This is the Boyds, big art dynasty in this country, very, very important. If you know anything about Australian art, you'd know about Arthur Boyd. I went and saw an Arthur Boyd exhibition when some paintings came up to Katoomba, and they are striking. And if you've only seen them in photographs, they're impressive, but seeing them actually live, they're amazing. They really are. They are really arresting images. But this is Martin Boyd. This is their uncle. Martin Boyd was he was actually born while his family were travelling, and so he was born in Switzerland. And he's one of those Australians, I use the term Anglo-Australians, because they're one of those Australians, like Patrick White, who came from a very upper class, what Australia calls upper class, old money, 19th century old money. And really, our upper class is a bit not real. It's a bit shabby if you compare it to the English. But in Australia, it's like, oh yes, they think very well of themselves. Our that Anglo-Australian families. Now, those families they're called Anglo-Australian because there is that sort of push-pull. These are the people who called England home. So you will find in some older Australian texts, in older Australian things, there's always this talk of going home, going somewhere else, going to England. England is home, not Australia. Australia is sort of like this exiled place that you go to make money. So that's what the Anglo-Australian families are like. They're a bit odd if you're just Australian. If you're not one of them, they really are quite they're an unusual group. So there's that. These 4 books tell the story of the family in Melbourne. The Cardboard Crown, what he has done is he has fictionalized his family. He's called them the Langtons. But if you know the Boyds, then you can work out who's who in this. But it is not a purely one-to-one historical novel. He hasn't just gone and retold his family history, because that would be really boring. Have you read a lot of family histories? They're really, I mean, they're well meant, but a lot of them are just very unimaginative. So he starts the quartet with his grandmother, Guy Langton starts it with his grandmother, Alice Langton. Now, Alice Langton is based on Martin Boyd's actual grandmother. His grandmother is where the family money really came from. Huge influx of money came into the family. The family, her husband was a respectable member of the upper crust. His father was a judge, that sort of very establishment. Her father was a convict, something that they never spoke about. Nowadays, that would be the thing you'd be bragging about, is that your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was a convict, especially if they were a first fleeting convict. But he wasn't a first fleeting convict, he was just a convict. And she had remarkable amounts of wealth. How did she get remarkable amounts of wealth? Her father owned property in Melbourne, lots of property, and his daughter inherited them. Now, this is a point where Australia becomes very different from the rest of the world. Okay, so this is something that when I've talked about why Australian women are different to women in other books and other places in the world, one of the big key differences is money. Women could not only inherit, they could own property after they were married. It didn't rescind to their husband. So her property is her property. She never lost control of her own property. That was a legal part of Australian law in the mid-19th century. This is why Rochester didn't marry an Australian girl. No. You wouldn't go marrying an Australian girl because she has actual rights to her property. You can't declare her mad and lock her in the attic and nick her money. You just couldn't. It was not legally possible to do that because those rights were not transferred. They were hers. Okay? So she is a really important figure in terms of supporting the family. She's called by Martin Boyd, or Guy Langton, who's the otherwise narrator of this story, is called the Onion Lady, because you keep peeling off and peeling off and peeling off, and she supported everybody. The fortune supports these subsequent generations throughout the books. So we meet different... the reason I'm doing all these books together is because they can be read independently, but you will find characters in these ones and the relationships that they have will not make a huge amount of sense without having read the subsequent books. So it's actually better to read them as a quartet, to just read them from first to last. You can read them independently, but it is going to be a more difficult experience because the narrator, Guy Langton, does not reiterate every single relationship to the characters, to himself, through all the generations. It's very intergenerational. There's about 3 or 4 layers of generation in there. There's grandparents, parents, his generation, and his nephews. So it's a very multi-layered generationally, and you can get very, very lost. And so he is not re-explaining who people are, which is why we're doing all these together. So this one starts out talking about Alice Langton and her possible affair that she may or may not have desired while travelling in Europe. It's really quite lovely. It's a lovely book, but it's also, again, another one of those really strong female characters, this time written by a man. These were written mid-century, so throughout the 1950s. This one was very much based on his grandmother's diaries, but to read it as his grandmother is a stretch too far. They are novels, they are not history. The Difficult Young Man is very interesting. The Difficult Young Man is Dominic Langton, who is the narrator's brother. And the narrator's brother is actually based on Martin's brother, Merrick, who is the father of Arthur and so on and so forth. He is... It's a portrait that says as much about the character being portrayed as it does about the person discussing him. So it's very interesting to look at it in terms of how people are represented. So that one's a really interesting one. Outbreak of Love. Outbreak of Love. This is one of the few books that I've ever seen that actually talk about what it was like to be German Australian. One of Guy's aunts has married a German composer. And turns out, 1914, war is about to break out. But in this book, love breaks out in all sorts of uncomfortable places, which risks enormous disruption in the lives of the Langtons. Another really interesting book. And the end of this, I really like the end of this. The way you'll have to read it really. But this one is another one, is looking at Australia on the cusp of war. And finally, we have When Blackbirds Sing. When Blackbirds Sing is, again, we see Dominic, but Merrick did not go to war. Merrick did not go to war, Martin did. In the First World War, he travelled to England to sign up with the English army, not with the Australian army. As I said, these are Anglo-Australians. They don't actually have genuine, really genuine ties to England, but they see themselves in that way. So when war is declared, Dominic and Martin both travelled to England to sign up to serve in the British Army, not the Australian Army. Okay, very, very different. And it's really, there's not a lot of actual war stuff in it. Not a lot. If you're looking for a book about the front, this is not the book. Probably you would want to look at the Middle Parts of Fortune. That might be a better bet for you. But it is a book about the effects of war. Dominic finds himself shell-shocked. He finds his experience of war renders him pacifist and unwilling or unable to return to the front, which has him declared as shell-shocked, because it's better to be shell-shocked than to be a deserter. Definitely. And this one is, although he uses the character of Dominic, there is really a quality of his talking about his own disillusionment with war, his own grappling with what he went through. So it is another interesting book. It's probably one of the first books, definitely one of the first Australian books that is really talking more openly about that. Now, given that these came out in the 1950s, it didn't get the great earn the great reputation that they really ought to have, because Australian literary culture was rather backwards when these came out, and what these books are doing is more radical than just telling a story of a family. In Australia, they got likened to the Forsyte saga, which is very it's really terribly misreading of them. They do more interesting things than something like the Forsyte saga. They're not just the story of a family. They're also looking at identity. They're looking at how to be Australian when you're not really certain that's what you want to be. They're looking at class. They're looking at but they're also looking at how these are people who don't necessarily want to be Australia, but Australia has stamped itself on them. They can't be British. They'd like to be British. They'd like to be English. They'd like to say England is home, but they are too Australian to ever fit in there. You might know that that when I talked last time about women, depictions of women, and I said that, Australian women are not the headless nymphs. This is where the reference to headless nymphs comes from. There's actually a passage in it where there is a story of the headless nymph, and that's what I'm meaning when I talk about headless nymphs. I got it from this book. So, although Martin Boyd spent the majority of his life in England, and his family had a very complicated relationship to Australia, these are not English novels. Not at all, not in the least. The Australianness in them seeps through in spite, not because of, but in spite of Martin, in spite of the fact that he wants to write a nice English novel, but Australia will not let you do that. Your Australianness comes through, that Australian voice comes through. These are really fascinating novels. If you are at all interested in that that establishment class, this is Melbourne, but this is the same class that Patrick White belongs to. If you read these, then actually Patrick White's The Eye of the Storm and the main character in that makes a great deal more sense, because they're talking about the same class. Patrick White very rarely wrote about that, his own class. The Twineborn Affair is about his own class. And there's a little degree of that in the vivisector as well. But most of his very, very, very well-known novels, like The Tree of Man, or like Voss, or The Solid Mandala, are not about this upper class in Australia, in our classless society. Yes, we still have an upper class. The moneyed elite. And so it's a group that Patrick White very rarely speaks about, though he belonged to, and part of the reason he, like Martin, was able to do the work that he did was because he had family money. Martin had family money that enabled him to become a writer. And he gave us these books. These books that tell us something of what it is to be Australian and something of what it is to be Australian even against your will. So, that is the Langton Quartet. And I will be back again sometime later with another adventure in Australian literature. So, bye-bye.
If you would like to support this channel, come across to the Black Cockie Press website, www.blackcockiepress.com.au, where you will find books and other writing services to help with your writing.